My name is Dr. Jim Parsons. For 19 years, I have served as a forensic pathologist at Mary's Medical Center in Chicago. In that time, I have performed over 4,000 autopsies bodies that came to me from the quiet grip of natural death to the blood-soaked aftermath of brutal murders. Every case has its own voice, its own story etched in scars, bruises, or the silence of a heart that no longer beats. I thought I had seen everything a human body could reveal, every possible way flesh could betray life. But I was wrong. There was one case that still claws at me in the dead of night. A case that whispers to me when the lights flicker. In my office, when the silence of the morgue stretches too long. On the surface, it appeared simple. Another suicide. A man found hanging in his bathroom. Depressed, abandoned by his wife, unemployed, and hopeless. Police reports confirmed the narrative. All the evidence pointed toward despair, toward a rope and a final breath. But when the body was brought to me, something felt wrong. So wrong that my skin tightened before I even touched him. And that was only the beginning. The body arrived late in the evening. The corridors of Mary's Medical Center were unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes every footstep echo like a warning. 2 officers wheeled the gurney into the autopsy room, their faces drawn and tired, eager to finish the paperwork and leave. I signed the chain of custody forms, my pen scratching against the paper louder than it should have been. When the sheet was pulled back, I saw him clearly for the first time. Male, early 40s, average build. His face was pale, the skin around his neck mottled with the bruising of supposed hanging. His clothes were perfectly arranged, too perfectly. His shirt looked freshly ironed, his shoes spotless. Something about it disturbed me immediately. Suicides rarely prepared themselves like this. They are messy, desperate, impulsive. This man looked as though he had been dressed for an appointment, not his own death. The officers left, and the heavy doors of the autopsy room closed with a metallic thud. I was alone with him. Above me, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly. The air vents whispered a constant breath of cold air. I pulled on my gloves and reached for my instruments. That was when I first touched his hands, and I knew this was no ordinary case. Hands never lie. They are the first battleground in a struggle for life. In suicides by hanging, the hands often tell the story. Broken nails, defensive scratches against the rope, bloodied skin where the victim instinctively fights the tightening noose. But this man's hands were pristine. Not a single broken nail, not a trace of blood or abrasion. They looked almost manicured, as though someone had carefully cleaned them before he was found. That was my first chill, the first true fracture in the narrative of suicide. I bent closer, studying the creases of his palms, the faint marks on his knuckles. There was tension in his fingers, a stiffness inconsistent with the usual post-mortem relaxation. It felt less like the hand of a man who gave up, more like the hand of a man silenced before he could resist. I marked my notes carefully, aware that every detail could matter later. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder in the silence, as though the room itself was listening. And as I turned back to the body, the thought struck me with brutal clarity. If his hands did not fight, then who tied the rope? The next step was the internal examination. Suicides by hanging often leave behind a pattern, not only in the neck, but in the stomach as well. Despair rarely dines. Most who decide to take their own life have not eaten for hours, sometimes days. But when I opened the stomach cavity, the truth unsettled me further. Food recently consumed, partially digested. The scent of cooked meat and vegetables still lingered, faintly, unmistakably fresh. He had eaten just hours before death. This did not fit the picture of a man moments away from ending everything. Instead, it suggested intent to live, someone preparing for something routine, maybe even hopeful. His clothes confirmed that suspicion. Clean pressed, as though someone had cared about appearances, as though he had somewhere to go. I paused, staring at the open cavity before me. Questions pressed against my mind. Who cooks themselves a meal before suicide? Who shines their shoes? Who smooths out their shirt? The image of a man tightening a rope in despair was slipping away, replaced by something darker, something staged. And then came the neck. When I saw the marks, every nerve in my body told me this was not suicide. The neck tells the final chapter of every hanging. In a true suicide, the ligature mark is angled rising upward toward the point of suspension, usually behind the ear. It's consistent, predictable, the rope leaving its cruel signature across the skin. But when I examined this man's throat, my stomach tightened. The mark was horizontal, flat, uniform, not the sharp angled groove of a rope pulled by gravity. Instead, It was the crushing indentation of fingers, of something pressed hard against the flesh. It looked less like a man who hanged himself, more like a man who had been strangled. I leaned closer, tracing the bruising, my gloves brushing against skin that seemed to whisper its story. Petechial hemorrhages dotted his eyes, tiny red bursts, caused by pressure, by suffocation. They were not consistent with hanging, but with manual strangulation. For a moment, the room felt colder. My breath fogged faintly in the fluorescent light, though the temperature had not changed. My gloved fingers trembled in that silence. A thought surfaced with the weight of absolute certainty. Someone had killed him, and someone wanted it to look like suicide. I stepped back from the table, my pulse racing. Years of training had taught me to remain calm, to treat every case with cold detachment. But something about this body refused to stay silent. I prepared to continue with the cranial examination. My scalpel glinted under the sterile light as I adjusted the angle. That was when the room itself seemed to shift. The fluorescent bulbs above me flickered, once, twice, then dimmed. The ventilation system hissed louder, a sudden surge of icy air rushing through the vents, prickling the skin on my neck. My breath caught in my chest, and then movement. Not from me. From him. I froze. His lips, they moved, just slightly. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way rigor mortis can sometimes distort perception. But then I heard it faint, broken, like air pushed through dry leaves. A whisper. Justice. My scalpel slipped from my fingers, clattering against the steel tray. My gloved hands trembled as the whisper came again, clearer, chilling every nerve in my body. This is not suicide. This is murder. The corpse had spoken. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The sound still echoed in my ears. Too sharp, too real to dismiss as imagination. My training told me to rationalize it. Stress, fatigue, auditory hallucination. But no clinical explanation could quiet the chill crawling through my veins. I forced myself to lean in, my eyes locked on his. Lips, they were still, again, frozen in silence. His body lay motionless, as it should. But the air around him, it felt charged, heavy, almost waiting. With hands that barely obeyed me, I picked up the scalpel again. I had to finish. I had to push forward, document, search for proof that went beyond whispers. I began the cranial incision. The saw buzzed against bone, a familiar sound, usually mechanical and detached. But that night, it felt like a scream echoing through the room. My chest tightened with every second. And then, as if mocking me, the whisper returned stronger, closer. Find him. Don't let him walk free. I dropped the saw, sweat dripping beneath my mask. The corpse was pleading with me. Not for an autopsy. For justice. My hands shook as I steadied myself. I told my mind what my heart refused to believe. Corpses do not whisper. I forced myself back into protocol, back into science. If there was truth here, I would find it not in phantom voices, but in evidence. I focused on the details I had overlooked. I reached for his hands again, this time with greater care. Under the clinical light, I noticed a faint discoloration at the base of his fingernails, a shadow almost invisible to the eye. I used a fine tool and carefully scraped beneath. That was when I found it, a fragment, small, thin, a piece of tissue wedged under the nail, clinging with dried blood. My pulse surged. This was not his. The color was wrong, the texture foreign. It was the trace of another struggle, another body. I placed the sample into a sterile container, sealing it for DNA testing. For the first time that night, I felt less like a pathologist and more like a witness, someone the dead had chosen to carry their story. I wrote in my notes, hand trembling, possible foreign tissue beneath fingernails. Submit for DNA analysis. The corpse had given me a clue. The tissue sample was sent immediately to the lab. I tried to distract myself with the remaining procedures, but my thoughts circled endlessly around that fragment beneath his nails. Victims do not die silent deaths. They leave traces, fragments, signatures of resistance. 2 days later, the report arrived on my desk. I opened the envelope with clinical detachment, but what I read inside stripped that away in an instant. The DNA did not belong to the deceased. It belonged to someone else. The name printed at the bottom made me sit back in shock. Harrison, a retired Army officer, age 62, record clean, service honorable. There was no documented connection between the two men, none that I knew of. Yet there it was, Harrison's blood beneath the fingernails of the man who had supposedly taken his own life. My chest tightened. This was no coincidence. This was the tether between two bodies. Two stories bound by violence. I called the police immediately, urging them to investigate. They sounded skeptical at first, but evidence doesn't lie. They promised to track down Harrison, to bring him in for questioning. But when they finally found him, he wasn't alive. When the call came in, I knew before the officer even spoke. His voice was tight, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has seen too much in too short a time. They had found Harrison, but not living. His body was discovered in his home, slumped against the kitchen wall. No signs of forced entry, no clear weapon, just another corpse, another mystery wrapped in silence. When they brought him to my table, a dreadful symmetry unfolded. His hands, his aged veined hands, were stiff, his nails dark with what looked like dried skin and blood. My heart thudded as I leaned closer. The sample beneath his nails was unmistakable. It wasn't his. The circle had closed. One man, found hanging, with Harrison's blood beneath his nails. And now Harrison, dead, with evidence of another struggle beneath his own. The whisper returned to me that night as I documented the wounds. It coiled through the silence of the autopsy room, as though both men were speaking through the walls of death itself. Justice, find him. He walks free. 2 dead men, 2 messages, and 1 unseen killer still alive. I spread the 2 case files across my desk, their photographs staring back at me in stark black and white. 2 men, strangers by all official records, now bound by traces of each other's blood. The first victim 42, unemployed, depression noted. The second 62, a retired soldier with no history of mental illness. Yet both had died in ways that defied their supposed causes. The first staged as a hanging, the second, with no clear explanation at all. I flipped through the autopsy notes again, highlighting the similarities. Both had eaten shortly before their deaths. Both were dressed in unusually clean clothes, as if prepared by someone else. Both had suspicious injuries, inconsistent with their alleged causes of death. But what struck me most, both had left behind the same chilling residue. Whispers, no. Not physical evidence. Not something I could measure or photograph. But I could not ignore what I had heard. Twice, in different rooms, at different times, the same plea had cut through the silence. Justice. We were murdered. I stared at the files long into the night. This wasn't just forensic science anymore. It was something far darker. Something or someone wanted the truth revealed. Harrison's autopsy was heavier on my soul than most. Years in the military had carved discipline into his body. Yet, even in death, there was no peace. His face bore faint bruising along the jawline, a smear of skin abrasion across his neck. Not enough to kill him, but enough to suggest a fight. When I examined his stomach contents, the same unsettling truth emerged: he had eaten shortly before death. A full meal, not the empty gut of someone preparing to die. His shirt, too, was pressed clean, his boots polished to mend. 2 meals, 2 staged deaths, and then, under his nails, more tissue fragments, different this time. Not the first victims. Someone else entirely. Another thread leading to another shadow. The evidence suggested Harrison hadn't been the killer at all. He had been another pawn, just like the first man, pulled into the same invisible web. But the strangest moment came when I leaned closer to note the injuries. The room chilled again. The fluorescent lights flickered, and his lips twitched. A faint whisper escaped, one that matched the first body's final plea. He killed us both. Don't let him walk free. I wasn't just examining corpses anymore. I was listening to witnesses. By now, sleep had abandoned me. Every night, I returned to my office long after hours, reviewing the files under the pale glow of my desk lamp. The evidence spoke louder than the silence of the morgue. 2 men dead, both whispering the same word from beyond. Justice. But Harrison's nails had revealed something more. The DNA analysis confirmed it under the profile. Neither his nor the first victim's. A third person. Unknown. That discovery coiled in my chest like a serpent. If the killer's skin had been left beneath Harrison's nails, then Harrison had fought back. He had seen his attacker. He had touched him. And in that violent moment, he had torn away proof. I studied the lab results over and over again. Male, mid-30s, not in any criminal database. A ghost. Yet he was out there, walking freely through the city, breathing while the men he silenced now lay cold on my table. The more I stared at those reports, the more the whispers returned, not faint this time, but constant, gnawing, echoing against the walls of my skull. Find him. Don't let us fade. Don't bury the truth. The dead were guiding me, and I knew I could no longer ignore them. 19 years in the morgue had taught me to separate myself from the dead, to see them as evidence, not as people, to cut, measure, record, and then let go. But these two men refused to let me go. Every time I stepped into the autopsy room, the air felt heavier. The hum of the fluorescent lights was no longer background noise. It was a reminder, a signal that something unseen waited just beyond the veil. The first victim's body still lingered in cold storage. Harrison's lay beside him, drawers separated by steel, but the space between them felt alive, charged. Sometimes, when I walked past, I could swear I heard faint knocks from within the cabinets. Not loud, not constant, just enough to stop me in my tracks. I told myself it was stress, that my mind was weaving patterns in shadows. But then, one night, as I passed their storage units, I heard it clearly. Two whispers, overlapping, distinct. "Doctor, don't stop. Doctor, he is still out there." I froze, clipboard slipping from my grasp, scattering papers across the floor. The dead weren't content with silence. They wanted a voice. And somehow, they had chosen mine. I began to dig deeper, not with a scalpel, but with questions. Harrison's life, his records, his connections, the first victim's past, his habits, his failures. On the surface, they had nothing in common. One, a broken civilian. The other, a decorated soldier, worlds apart. But as I traced the timeline, small overlaps began to surface. Places, names. A bar on the south side of Chicago, where both men had been seen weeks before their deaths. A community meeting where Harrison had been a guest speaker. By the first victim, sitting silently in the back row. Coincidence? Or a web carefully woven? The whispers grew louder the more I searched. At night, in my office, I would hear the faint scrape of footsteps when the hall outside was empty. Sometimes, the pages of the files would flutter though no air moved. And always, that voice in my ear. "He ties us together. Find him." I realized then that these deaths weren't isolated events. They were chapters in a larger story, one written in bruises and staged scenes. Somewhere in the city, a man was hunting, and I was the only one listening to his victims. The bar was dimly lit, its neon sign flickering like the morgue's failing lights. It smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, the kind of place where faces blur into smoke and secrets. I had no business being there, doctors. Don't chase ghosts into back alleys. But I had to follow the thread. The bartender was reluctant at first, polishing glasses with the kind of detachment only years of silence can teach. But when I slid a photograph across the counter, first the victim, then Harrison, his eyes flickered. Recognition. "Yeah," he muttered. They were both here, different nights, didn't talk much, but they weren't alone. My pulse quickened. Who were they with? The man hesitated, scanning the empty bar, as though the shadows might be listening. Then quietly, "Some guy, mid-30s, dark jacket." Never gave a name, but he watched people, like he was taking notes. Gave me the creeps. A nameless ghost, fitting the DNA profile perfectly. I pressed for more, but the bartender shook his head. "I don't want trouble. If you're smart, you'll leave it alone." But leaving it alone was no longer an option. The dead had found their killer. And now, so had I. Back in my office, I spread the evidence across the table. The reports, the photos, the bartender's description. A man in his 30s, nameless, faceless, but always there, circling the victims like a predator. I called in a favor from a detective I trusted, someone who still believed my instincts after years of cases together. I gave him the description and asked him to comb through local surveillance footage. It was a long shot, but luck or fate was on our side. Hours later, an email arrived. A still image, grainy, but enough. A man, mid-30s, dark jacket, standing just behind Harrison at that community meeting weeks ago. His eyes fixed not on the speaker, but on the crowd, watching, calculating. I enlarged the photo until the pixels blurred, but his face remained, burned into my vision. My detective had managed to pull a partial ID. Daniel Crow. No criminal record. No arrests. Just an ordinary name, hiding an extraordinary darkness. But the whispers that night confirmed what the files couldn't. Crow. He killed us. The corpses had spoken a name. And I knew now I wasn't chasing shadows. I was hunting a man. Once the name surfaced, things changed. Files began to disappear from my desk. Reports I had written meticulously were found misplaced, pages missing. The morgue's cameras, always recording, glitched whenever I worked late at night. It wasn't coincidence. Daniel Crow knew. One evening, As I walked to my car in the hospital's underground lot, I felt it a presence. Heavy footsteps echoing just far enough behind me to keep me questioning. I turned, but the rows of parked cars stared back in silence. Still, the feeling remained, watching, measuring. I gripped my keys like a weapon, my heart pounding as I slid into the driver's seat. In the rearview mirror, for a split second, I saw him, a shadowed figure standing near the exit, head tilted, as if studying me. Then the lights flickered, just like in the morgue, and he was gone. That night, the whispers returned stronger than ever, both voices layered over each other, desperate, urgent. "Doctor, he's close. Don't let him silence you too." For the first time in 19 years, I realized I was no longer just the examiner of bodies. I was a potential body. My self-sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the first victim hanging in his spotless clothes. Harrison slumped against his kitchen wall. Their lips moved in silence until the whispers filled my skull. "Crow, don't let him walk free." The weight of their pleas pressed on me harder than any scalpel I had ever held. I knew now this wasn't just forensic evidence. This was testimony delivered through cold flesh and voices no one else could hear. I worked through the night, building a file the police couldn't ignore. Photos of ligature marks, inconsistent with hanging. Lab results proving foreign DNA. Beneath both victims' nails. Witness accounts placing Crow at the bar and the community meeting. Piece by piece, the puzzle took shape, and with it, a chilling image of a man who killed not out of desperation, but out of ritual. As dawn broke, I sat at my desk surrounded by the files, my body heavy with exhaustion. The morgue was silent, but not empty. I could feel them near, standing behind me, urging me forward. And then, for the first time, the whisper was not a plea, it was a command. "Finish it." Morning sunlight spilled through the blinds as I carried the files into the precinct. My steps felt heavier than they ever had, leaving the morgue. Inside that folder was everything: the photographs, the DNA reports, the witness statements. And behind those pages were the voices of two men who refused to rest. The detectives read in silence. Their skepticism faded line by line, replaced by the grim understanding that evidence does not lie. Crow's name, once a ghost in the shadows, was now tethered to proof. An arrest warrant was signed before noon. As I watched them prepare, relief should have washed over me. Yet I felt only the weight of eyes I could not see. In that moment, in the quiet corner of the precinct, I heard them one final time. Not faint, not pleading, clear, certain. "Thank you." The chill left the air. The whispers faded. For the first time in weeks, the morgue felt like a morgue again. Not a courtroom for the dead. But I know this: the voices chose me once. And if another body arrives with secrets buried in flesh and bone, they will choose me again. Because some truths refuse to stay silent.